Howard was on duty that Saturday, and he called me at the farm and said the most extraordinary thing. He said, "You won't believe what happened last night." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, two really incredible incidents." He said some people were driving a car, and apparently they were drinking or something, but they went through the wall of a house, and in the living room, where two people were making love on the sofa, and out the other side. And he said, this was one incident, and the other thing, he said, well, there were these 5 men who were caught in the Democratic headquarters wearing surgical gloves. And he told them to me as equal stories. And like, the other thing didn't develop quite the way Watergate did.
The glories of newspapering.
Yeah.
And you certainly didn't sense the seriousness of it at that point.
Well, nobody could, because it just seemed like a farce. And it was a farce until they got into court, when, of course, the date book in one of the burglars' pockets had the Howard Hunt's initials and W.H. Whitehouse and his phone number. And so that suggested immediately that this was strange, and that maybe it was even linked to the White House. Nobody quite thought it was or believed that then. But the farce thing didn't last long.
Mm-hmm. And you said in your book several times that you thought the Post was lucky in several aspects. And maybe one of the lucky things was that the story was given to the Metro staff and to Woodward and Bernstein instead of the national staff.
Well, it was, because I think that, as George said, the national staff, I think I would add a little bit, George, and I hope you agree with me, I think they were very skeptical about the story at first. Is it right? I don't think that they would have,
They wouldn't believe the White House would orchestrate a burglary.
No, they wouldn't. And the reason that Woodward and Bernstein were just a great team was because they were very young. They were both not with people or married, and they were working 16 hours a day and 7 days a week. And they were loose, they were not covering a beat. And so they could, in fact, they were put on the story. And I don't think that it would have happened under national.
And so for a while it's a great story, right? It's very exciting. Yeah. There's more revelations. Yeah. But there comes a point when suddenly you sense that this is something really serious.
Well, that really was in October, when the 2 big stories broke about the fact that, as was said in the earlier group, that all these things were connected and that they were really massive. And that Haldeman and Ehrlichman were involved. And so that was in October. Mm-hmm. And then the pressure got very, very tough.
And how did the pressure, what form did it take?
Well, it took a lot of silly forms and one very, very serious form. The serious part were 2. They attacked our credibility on every level. And they wouldn't answer phone calls from the Post. They were told not to speak to our reporters. What was rather ludicrous was they were told not to come to dinner at my house. And I think that, people like George Shultz and even Henry, came.
Well, Pete Peterson, right?
Pete Peterson
who was Secretary of Commerce,
Pete
right?
Peterson was a great friend, and he was very irreverent. And he got into trouble during those months, and one of the troubles he found himself in was that Haldeman called him, and the White House operators would find anybody anywhere, and they unfortunately found Pete at my house in the country. And I think that had a good deal to do with other things, remarks he'd make, with the fact that he was fired the minute Nixon was reelected.
Went from the friends list to the enemies list.
Yes, he did.
But a lot of this stuff was happening in October, and we're in the middle of a presidential election, right?
Right.
And McGovern is way behind in the polls, right?
Yes.
And the Washington Post has a policy of not endorsing, right?
Right.
Did you ever talk about maybe this is serious, maybe we should break our policy, maybe we should endorse on the editorial page? Did that ever come up?
Well, I think that almost indirectly we did endorse by talking about issues, but no, it didn't come up as a part of that decision. Mm-hmm. We inherited the no endorse rule. Mm-hmm. I think it dated from the time when the District of Columbia didn't have a vote, and my father had set this policy, and we just adopted it. But of course, we changed it later.
Mm-hmm. How involved were you in the stories? Would Ben tell you about every story?
No, certainly not. And I was not directly involved with Woodward and Bernstein, but I was involved with both Ben and Howard, and I talked to them constantly about how did we know we were right, because I forgot the second part of this. The real threat was the challenge to our television station licenses, which were up for renewal in Florida. And when the tapes came out, they literally censored this part where Nixon is saying to Haldeman, do they have television stations up for license renewals? Because that is one way we can get at them, and they are going to have big trouble. And that is said in and that's on the tapes.
When did they actually mount? They found some friends, right, to mount these challenges?
There were 3 challenges in Jacksonville and 1 in Miami, and almost all of them were obviously politically motivated, mostly by committee to reelect the president people or friends of Nixon's or friends of Agnew's down there. And some of them were just plain people who thought there was blood in the water and wanted our licenses.
Was this during that same time period?
They came in January.
After he had been reelected. Yeah. They had this tape system, obviously, in the White House. Did you ever talk or fear that they had tried to put a tap in the Post?
Yeah, somebody said, I guess Ed Williams got involved, Edward Bennett Williams was a famous criminal lawyer, but he was our lawyer at the time, and he was a friend of Ben's, and so he was very involved with everything. And at one point, the issue arose about were we being taped or even followed, and I think that was paranoia. Not that paranoia doesn't sometimes have a reason, but I think that probably people were overly wrought up.
You never saw any evidence of it?
We really went over the phones very carefully, and we never found any proof that anybody was listening.
What about tax stuff? Anybody do any IRS stuff?
Listen, mine are done every year.
It's a holdover.
Tell me about it.
Through all these administrations.
Well, I don't know.
Now, there came a time after Nixon was reelected when you had broken a lot of stories, right? That the whole White House was involved in this illegal activity. And then there was a period of time when there weren't many stories, right?
Right, at the most terrible time for us, right after the election. The story simply dried up. And of course, we were really uptight about that because everybody had said we were just, this was a political vendetta, and that we were just trying to harass the president who, they didn't believe us. And in fact, other papers didn't believe us. For a long time, we ran these stories and nobody picked them up. They'd go out on the wire and nobody would run them. And then little by little, of course I want to give credit for, there was reporting in the Times and in the LA Times and in Time Magazine and Newsweek. But that came later, and for a long time we were alone.
What about your social life? What about your friends? Did they come to you and say, why are you doing all this? I mean, Joe Alsop was a critic, right?
Well, Joe was a critic right along because Joe was he was a great friend of mine, but he was very close to the administration, and he simply didn't believe it till really the tapes came out. And he would tell me, darling, you have to be careful, you have to stop this, you don't know what you're doing. Andre Meyer, who was a friend of mine, who was the head of Lazar at that point, said, I know that you have to be careful, and if you make a mistake, Pete Peterson came to see me very nicely because that was dangerous for him and said, you better be right, because if you're not, this is going to be big trouble.
Did you lose some sleep over this?
I sure did. You would have been crazy if you hadn't.
But you had confidence in Ben and in Howard and in the careful
I did. You know, you had to be worried because even Ben, I think, was worried. But I would go to him constantly and say, how do we know we're right? How do we know we're being accurate? How do we know we're being fair? How do we know we're not being led up a garden path and the ground's going to be cut out from under us? And Ben would say three things. He said, first of all, that the fact that we were alone was great because the boys could be careful, and quite often they pulled stories back and they double-checked. We two-sourced everything. I have a feeling, you know, somebody said that two sources were not as... Harry Rosenfeld said to me he really thought that two sources was not as great as it sounded, but that's what we thought. And then he said, lastly, well, I think we really tried to double-check, and that was probably right. Lastly, he said, you know, Woodward has a source that he goes to when he's puzzled about a story, and the source has never misled him. And I don't know who Deep Throat is, but I have every reason to think that Deep Throat, A, was a man, and B, was a single person, and C, he existed as such, because Ben really said that to me as part of the reassurance.
That it was a man, it was a person.
He didn't say, no, he didn't say that. He said he has a source. And I think that, you know, I just think it was a man.
Mm-hmm. And, but you never asked him who it was?
I sort of asked Woodward facetiously one day when I got nervous about not being near Woodward and Bernstein and not really knowing them very well. And I knew how young they were. And so I said to Ben and Howard, I would really like to meet with these kids and get to know them a little bit. And so actually Carl was out of town, and Bob and Howard and I had lunch. And during that lunch I said to Bob, you know, I said, tell me who's Deep Throat. Because by that time Howard had been the Deep Throat was a dirty movie that was out at the time. And I don't know why Howard called this guy Deep Throat, I mean, if it was a guy. And so I said, tell me who it is. And Woodward, I had to use Woodward's book because I didn't really remember. Woodward naturally went right downstairs and took notes on everything. And so he had all this conversation written up, and he said that I'd asked him who was Deep Throat, and that he looked stricken. And I said, "Oh, don't bother. I don't worry. I don't want the responsibility. You don't have to tell me." And so I never really pursued it very seriously.
Did you ever think twice about that? I mean, your family's business could have been at stake. You're being challenged to 2 TV licenses. You got these young kids out there. They're obviously attacking you on every level they could think of.
Well, you know, the identity of Deep Throat was, he was not a source, Peter. He was Woodward used him to check with, as I understood it then and I think now. And I think that this was a source, you know, that he went to when he was puzzled about this story or that story. And he really was very reaffirming to Bob, I think. I still, as I say, I didn't pursue it because I don't think that I thought that everything depended on Deep Throat. I was pretty nervous, but it was a variety of things that made me nervous. I was going to say, you know, Ziegler was attacking us every day for our reporting and innuendo and guilt by association and the things we were alleged to be doing, and the Washington Post is crazy, and you know, and it was very, very tough atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. You were here this afternoon, and I think John Fialka from the Wall Street Journal said he was at the Washington Star at the time, and he would read the stories where Deep Throat was used, this source was used. And he said, I think, that it seemed to him that it was an omniscient source. It was somebody who could see the story from all angles. And he always thought it might have been the head of an intelligence agency. And he said, isn't that an interesting constitutional question if an intelligence agency knocked off a sitting president?
I don't think that, I think that's giving Deep Throat entirely too much credit.
Interesting. Do you think that...
I mean, look, I don't know the details of it, and Bob and Carl do, and Ben does, but I think I'm right.
Well, you say that it's the only secret Ben has ever kept, right?
Well, it's the only secret Washington's ever kept.
And it'll be revealed when the man dies. Do you think the use of that source at your newspaper and others, do you think it led to the overuse of anonymous sources or contributed to that?
I don't know. That's a hard question. I don't think, again, anonymous sources was another issue. I don't think that I think that Deep Throat's importance in all this is overplayed. I don't even think that Bob quoted him that much. I could be wrong. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you could tell about that. I don't know. John Fialka's he's terrific, and he may have read it more carefully than I did, but at the time, I wouldn't have thought that he was that important in the whole thing.
What were the positives and the negatives of the Watergate investigation for the Post?
The positives were that for the first time our profile was very high. People knew who we were. The paper had been very small and developing, and Ben had come in 65, and we're now at 73 and 72 to 4, of course. And so that's about 9 years that Ben had been editing by the time we got to the end of Watergate. And, excuse me. So, it put us on the map. And our credibility turned out to be verified. And I guess we became a major league player. Now the negatives. I quoted John Anderson, who was an editorial writer, who said, "We paid a price for this because the letdown was terrific." And I think the paper was on hold for a while because we were so paralyzed by the concentration on the story.
And I think you said that the Metro staff all wanted to do investigations, right?
Well, there was a little bit of that. And, there was a little bit over-investigatory thing for a while, but I think that got in balance after a while and we got going again. But you paid a sort of emotional price. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that the country did.
Did you think that you paid a personal, emotional price? I mean, there was that lewd, rude comment by John Mitchell that Katie Graham is going to get a sensitive part of her anatomy caught in a wringer if she continues this.
Well, there was a concentration on me as the personification of the paper because I think that that I was a woman in this job, and therefore there was a lot of concentration on this was all my doing. And so this is still going on. Dawn's been publisher of the Post since 1979, and people, including people in high office, still think that I've gone down there and told them to do something. It's quite crazy.
Well, you're one of the most powerful women in America.
Well, I've been out of power for quite a while.
We'd be happy to take some questions from the audience. I thought there were going to be some on cards, and if there are, please give them to me.
I think people are saturated.
And if not, you can walk down to this microphone or that microphone, but please be careful walking down. But since we're taping, we'd like your questions on television, if possible. Your late husband, Phil, was involved in Democratic politics, right?
Well, it was personal with Kennedy and Johnson, right?
Did you ever think of, if he had lived, how he would have handled this? Did that ever occur to you during all this?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, once you get started, you really don't. Yeah.
Who would you depend on for advice? Just Ben or who?
Ben and Howard.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody outside the paper.
Were the people on the business side supportive of this?
They were. They really were. Fritz Beebe who was the chairman of the company, who died in the middle of it, actually, in 73, I guess. But he was a lawyer, and he was very editorially minded, and he was wonderful. I depended a lot on him. But all the business people, I must say, totally supported it.
And you never really lost any business?
Oh yes, we were cut. Some advertising dropped us.
Just because they thought you were being unfair?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. But you followed through with it anyway.
Sure.
And why? Did you feel that it was the thing you do as a publisher? What was
No, but you know, whereas in the case of the Pentagon Papers, the decision came up to me and I decided that issue that we would print. There was never a moment of decision in Watergate. You started with the farce we talked about, the breaking and entering, and then you gradually got into the water deeper and deeper until these two big stories broke in October. And I don't think that, you know, there was no going back. There was no decision to make. You just had to keep going. And we talked about the story drying up, and Ben and Howard are both very funny about this. They said they were literally beating Woodward and Bernstein to get on with
story?
it. And finally, I guess it was, I forget what big story broke, but anyway,
But finally there was a story.
Finally there was a story.
How did you feel when you learned that President Nixon had resigned, and where were you?
Well, when it became apparent that he would have to, after the smoking gun tape came out, I was on vacation on Martha's Vineyard, and I got on a plane and went right back to the paper because I thought I wanted to be there and I thought it was going to happen. And so I was there for 2 or 3 or 4 days before and during the resignation. And then when he left in the helicopter, I just went back to the vineyard, and I was there and turned on the television. And the first time I heard the word President Ford, I just couldn't believe it, and I really did feel relieved. But I didn't take any personal pleasure in this. I really would like to emphasize that. We were pleasured, we were pleased at having our reporting vindicated, but I don't think that anybody wanted to bring him down or thought that the President of the United States having to resign because he would be impeached was a great event for the country. We didn't.
What did you think of the movie, All the President's Men?
Well, I tell this story in the book because Redford and I got across each other, and we both heartily disliked each other because I was the one nominated to say no if we didn't want to cooperate, or no that we didn't want the film done in the city room. And so I got too self-conscious and negative about it, I think, in hindsight. And I think the movie, when it came out, I thought right away it was a great movie. I still do. You know, he said, well, we're going to do this wonderful movie. It's going to be about the First Amendment. And I thought, forget that. How can you do a movie about the First Amendment? But he did.
I struggled with that
He did.
myself.
It was a great movie. I loved All the President's Men.
But you say in your book that it caused some dissension within the Post.
You know, it did. Meg Greenfield, the editor of the editorial page, pointed that out when I was doing re-interviewing for the book. She said it was really like the apple of discord. It somehow raised tensions because certain people, like Ben, just for the story's sake, really it wasn't Ben's fault, but Howard was put into Ben's, you know, what Howard contributed was put into Ben's.
Ben got credit for
Yeah.
it.
And Barry Sussman, who was a Metro editor, didn't appear at all. And,
Right.
and there was even tension between the editorial page and the news page. And I don't know, it really did cause a lot of problems that were emotional problems.
Amazing what celebrity culture can do to people, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Interesting. We got this from two people, a question from the audience. 25 years later, is the Washington Post better or worse because of Watergate?
Well, I think it's better, much better than it was, because we've grown and we've tried to improve the paper continuously. And I don't think that it was better or worse because of Watergate, but I think we were in the process of building up during Watergate and did afterwards. And I have to say, I think the paper is better now than when I left. I mean, I think it's I really believe in it.
What about journalism? Do you think it was a plus for journalism? A lot of people went into journalism because of Watergate.
Well, I think it was a plus for journalism because we were on a grill and our credibility was validated, sure.
Did you know Richard Nixon very well before all this happened?
I'd met him a few times, but I didn't really know him. as I've heard from people near him, he came in really disliking the press in general and the Post in particular, because going back to when he ran for vice president and the fund that the secret fund, which was really pretty small when you look back on it, but there was quite a sort of scandal about this hidden secret fund he had from political contributors. And the Post at that time, when he was running for vice president with Eisenhower, said he should get off the ticket. And then we'd been critical of his, he was so violently anti-communist and right-wing. I mean, not that you couldn't be anti-communist, but that he used it as a political weapon against Helen Gehrig and Douglas. And he came in with all this baggage, and I guess we got across each other right away.
So you never really had much of a relationship?
No, I met him a few times.
And it wasn't affected? He never called you during this or anything?
No, he called me once when he got elected. And he actually, he came to an editorial lunch when he was campaigning. I mean, we had perfectly proper professional relations before Watergate, never after that, of course.
He called you after he was elected?
No, he called me once and said that Henry Kissinger was working for him. Nobody had heard of Kissinger. And he said, he was National Security Advisor, and he said, I would like him to come over and brief your editors, and then Kissinger came to lunch. And I arranged it. And I met him in formal situations, but I never knew him well.